Wisely, Henry soon realized that he would have no business crossing the Alps to be crowned in Rome if he couldn't even get control of his own backyard. So his strategy from this point was to give his German kingdom precedence over Italy, Burgundy, Hungary, or Poland. Right away, Henry recognized that the Duchy of Saxony would be a perennial thorn in his side. The Saxons had grown increasingly confident in their own independence since the days of the Ottonians, who had hailed from the region. This, they felt, made them separate and different from the other duchies in the empire. Obviously, Henry didn't see it this way. At first, he had managed to temporarily subdue the duchy, but he miscalculated the level of support he had from the other parts of Germany when, in 1073, he tried to organize a punitive expedition to Poland to punish a local duke who hadn't appeared for a summons. Badly misunderstanding the level of support he had, Henry was taken completely by surprise when his vassals launched a revolt in protest. It was true that none of the other dukes or counts particularly liked the Saxons, but they definitely weren't going to blindly support the king in every foolhardy adventure just because he gave the Saxons a bloody nose that one time. Surrendering to his vassals, Henry was completely left out of the following debate about when to attack Poland. It now became extremely clear to Henry that he was much weaker than he had thought. He had lost this showdown badly, and unfortunately for him, it would not be the last time his vassals would revolt. Meanwhile, in Italy, Pope Gregory had been hard at work reshaping the Catholic Church in his image. He maintained regular correspondence with Henry, and for a while their relationship seemed positive, even if it wasn't on the most solid of ground. Eventually, though, the Pope soon realized that Henry would not relent in the matter of investiture, and knew that something drastic would have to be done. In 1075, the Pope held a synod in which he strictly forbade lay investiture, but didn't assign any punishment to it. Essentially, Pope Gregory was asking the kings of Europe to police themselves and work with local papal legates to end the practice. As you can imagine, the rulers of Europe looked at this new decree and after, I'd say about 5 seconds or so, crumpled it up and acted like they'd never even read it. What they didn't realize, however, is that this decree was the first warning shot of the larger conflict to come, and very soon, Henry would become the prime example of what can go wrong when you disobey the Pope. Now, about this time, Henry was feeling pretty good about himself. Since his initial embarrassing capitulation to his vassals, he had experienced a new wave of popularity after the entire German realm teamed up behind Henry to punish yet another Saxon revolt. But again, Henry overplayed his hand. Thinking he had more support than he actually did, Henry felt confident enough to ignore the Pope's 1075 synod and continued investing whoever he damn well pleased, to the Pope's dismay. Gregory, realizing he was at an impasse, sent a delegation to Germany to deliver a warning to this young king. In January of 1076, Henry was resting and waiting out the winter in one of his strongholds when he received a letter from the Pope. Gregory was officially calling his bluff. Henry was to either stop investing bishops or face excommunication from the church. Now this was a serious threat. Not only was an excommunicated ruler not allowed to receive sacrament, his vassals were no longer required to stay loyal to him. Gregory had officially thrown down the gauntlet. Feeling sure of himself, Henry reacted quickly. He announced that the Pope was officially deposed and that he would be replacing him shortly. Gregory responded that Easter by publishing his now famous excommunication of Henry, which was published in the form of a prayer to St. Peter. In it, Gregory says, quote, "I deprive King Henry, son of the Emperor Henry, who has rebelled against thy church with unheard of audacity, of the government over the whole kingdom of Germany and Italy, and I release all Christian men from the allegiance which they have sworn to him or may swear to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king." End quote. Obviously, things were now deadly serious. The Pope had superseded Henry's authority and, by virtue of this letter, had made clear that he thought he had the power to make or break kings. And, as it turns out, he did. Henry's vassals leapt at the chance to revolt, and in October 1076, they held a meeting at Trebur where they officially threw in their lot with the Pope. There, they declared that Henry had a year and a day to gain absolution from Gregory, or he would be officially deposed as their king. Henry was left with no choice. Traveling to the North Italian city of Canossa, where Gregory was staying, Henry got on his hands and knees outside the castle in a raging blizzard and begged the Holy Father for his kingdom back. Not only had he been humiliated, he also gave legitimacy to the idea that the Pope could depose kings with a single letter. This was obviously in sharp contrast to Henry's predecessors, who at times crowned and deposed popes as often as they changed clothes. Though the Pope relented, he had now made it abundantly clear that the papacy would no longer be a tool of the emperor. Back in Germany, Henry's vassals didn't view his humiliation as being necessarily a good thing for them because, yeah, he looked like an idiot for a few days, but so what? He was still king, and at least nominally had the Pope back on his side as a tenuous ally. They knew if they were to maintain their strong control over the empire, they needed a drastic solution. Meeting again in March, they declared that Henry was no longer their king, electing Duke Rudolf of Swabia as their king. Now at this point, you might think that Henry was on his last leg as king. But the actions of the nobles had actually turned much of the country against them, and gave Henry a boost in support he didn't previously have. Most of the bishoprics and towns in the empire thought the nobles had gone too far in electing an anti-king, so they sided with Henry. With most of Germany siding with the king, and the Pope not willing to explicitly endorse the actions of the nobles, all the momentum seemed to be on Henry's side. And in fact, the war was going well for him until 1080, when Pope Gregory made the fateful decision that would prolong the conflict and permanently dissolve any chances the papacy and the empire had of making peace. Gregory had been enraged when Henry sent delegates to more or less ask the Pope to explicitly pick a side. With this being the final straw, Henry was again excommunicated. This time, though, Henry was ready. On the 25th of June, the king declared that Gregory was officially deposed as pope and set up Clement III as an anti-pope. How exactly Henry intended to enforce this decision in Rome while he was pinned down fighting a civil war in Germany is unclear, but nevertheless, a stroke of good luck finally went in his favor. During a battle, the anti-king Rudolf was mortally wounded, and he died the next day. With this, the rebels had lost their raison d'etre, and soon withdrew their campaign. Henry, now secure enough in Germany, marched south to deal with his papal problem. Marching on Rome, the undisputed king of Germany deposed Gregory, and on March 31st, 1084, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. Though the German conspirators would try to elect another anti-king, their second rebellion proved even less fruitful than the first, and on Easter of 1085, Gregory's deposition, Clement's accession, and Henry's victory in the Civil War were all confirmed. It might have appeared like Henry couldn't be stronger, but below the surface there were very real cracks in the foundation. Many of his vassals still didn't fully respect him, Saxony had never truly been suppressed, and Norman encroachment into Italy continued almost unchecked. The years of 1088 to 1090 would prove to be Henry's most successful, and after putting down yet another revolt in Saxony, and after another expedition to Italy, the entire empire seemed to be exhausted for more than a decade of war. It is shortly after this war-weary time in the empire's history when the Crusades first began. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for a crusade on the Seljuk Turks, who had taken control of the Holy Land in Jerusalem. Across Europe, some 100,000 men left their homes to go fight in the east. Under normal circumstances, Emperor Henry, ostensibly the leading Christian monarch in Europe, would have led this expedition, but these were not ordinary circumstances for the empire. They had been exhausted from constant warfare, and nobody was in the mood to go off fighting and dying in some far-off desert after fighting and dying in their own backyard. Not a single German noble of any importance, with the exception of Godfrey of Bouillon, would go on crusade. As a result of Germany's collective refusal to take part in the crusade in the Middle East, the legacy with which we are left of Germany during these years is the unfortunate one of the wide-scale attacks on Jewish communities. The Rhineland massacres, as they would become known in later years, were an early sad display of the kind of anti-Semitism that was so prominent in Europe, and it became inexorably associated with the Holocaust later on. The Jewish communities in Germany presented an easy target for zealous German lords who didn't necessarily want to travel all the way to the Middle East, but still wanted a crusade. This legacy of religious warfare obviously has not went away, and we are even today living with the results of Pope Urban's fateful call in 1095. In 1099, Pope Urban died and was replaced by Pope Paschal II, who was an even more hardline reformist and anti-lay investiture pope than Gregory had been. Sensing a potential for the renewed conflict, Henry made overtures to Paschal to appeal to his better angels, but the pope refused them. Taking up Gregory's mission, Paschal excommunicated Henry once again and ensured that the schism between empire and papacy would last until Henry's death. All at once, Henry found himself yet again caught in a perfect storm of bad luck and bad timing. Shortly after his excommunication, Henry discovered that his son had raised his banners in revolt and intended to dethrone him with papal support. Unsurprisingly, the fickle German nobles flocked to their rebellion, and just like that, Henry was back to square one. In many ways, one can hardly blame the younger Henry for rebelling against his father. One day, the young man would inherit this empire, and at the moment, his dad was doing a pretty good job of screwing it up beyond repair. The younger Henry, as far as we can tell, wanted to inherit an empire of vassals who supported him, and a papacy that at the very least wasn't openly hostile towards him. If he took the kingdom now, he stood a chance of accomplishing all of it. Henry IV's fortunes during the rebellion waxed and waned, as he was captured by his son, but escaped. Shortly after this, though, exhausted and miserable from a hard life of constant turmoil and betrayal, Henry IV died on August 7th, 1106. He had reigned for 50 tumultuous years. This sad end to Henry's story is made worse by the near-Shakespearean events of his last years. Constantly betrayed and abandoned, the treason of his son proved to be the final coup de grace of his life. In a letter to the King of France from 1106, Henry laments the betrayal of his son, saying, quote, "This I cannot say without the greatest grief of heart and without many tears, and now that it is said, I tremble violently. The nobles not only turned the mind of my son against me, but also armed him with a great fury. So great was his rage that he usurped my kingly office, deposed my bishops and abbots, and substituted my enemies and persecutors." End quote. The younger Henry, now Henry V after taking his father's throne, had succeeded in his goal of turning the papacy and the nobles against his father, but even with his father dead, the same problems that had plagued Henry IV now plagued Henry V. The warning signs began to make themselves known early. With the conflict settled, Henry perhaps wanted to atone in some way for the betrayal of his father, so he requested that his father be granted absolution posthumously and given the proper Christian burial, but the Pope refused this. Realizing that he had the German nobility behind him, Henry felt confident enough to continue the practice of lay investiture, despite just years earlier siding with the papacy against his father. The investiture conflict was back on. In 1110, Henry invaded Italy, hoping to settle the matter once and for all. Once he was in Rome, the two sides could not agree on terms, and a riot broke out during which Henry's entourage kidnapped the Pope. About 2 months later, Paschal relented, and, before crowning Henry as Holy Roman Emperor, gave him the right of investiture. Obviously, this didn't sit well with the radicals inside the Reform Party, and Paschal was soon coerced into taking back his concessions to the emperor, once more igniting the conflict. The question of investiture would not finally be settled until 1122, when the new Pope, Calixtus II, and the emperor met in the city of Worms to hash out an agreement. The resulting concordat stipulated that the emperors had the right to invest bishops with their secular power, but not their religious power, and that an election without bribes would be held to replace bishops in the presence of the emperor. In exchange, the emperors would no longer have a role in choosing popes and had no say over the spiritual matters of the realm. The practical effects of this were that the empires had lost their grip on the church. Never again would they have quite so strong an influence on spiritual affairs.